You've maybe heard of Timbuktu as a metaphor for the ends of the earth, but in the 14th century, it was one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the world. Timbuktu, located in the Mali Empire, was a center of learning, culture, and trade. This story of wealth and intellectual flourishing is embodied in the journey of Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, who undertook a legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324. The Mali Empire, which began its rise in the 13th century under the leadership of Sundiata Keita, spanned a vast region of West Africa. It controlled numerous gold mines, making it one of the richest empires of its time. Under Mansa Musa, who ascended to the throne in 1312, the empire reached new heights of prosperity and influence. His reign marked the era of cultural and economic flourishing, transforming Mali into a beacon of wealth and knowledge. Mansa Musa decided to undertake the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, not just as a religious duty, but as a monumental display of his empire's wealth. His caravan was legendary. Over 60,000 men, including 12,000 slaves, each carrying gold bars and hundreds of camels laden with gold dust. This grand procession made its way across the Sahara Desert, through North Africa, and into the heart of the Islamic world. Legend has it that Mansa Musa's generosity was so immense that in Cairo, he distributed so much gold that it caused significant inflation, affecting the local economy for years. Whether exaggerated or not, these tales reflect an astonishing scale of his wealth and the lasting impression it left on those who witnessed it. The significance of Mali and Timbuktu was bolstered by the broader context of the Islamic world. During this period, the Muslim world was a tapestry of thriving trade networks that connected Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. These networks facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture, enabling empires like Mali to flourish. Mali's gold was a key component in this vast economic system, linking the wealth of Africa to the rest of the known world. As Europe struggled under the devastating grip of the Black Death, the Mali Empire thrived in contrast. Mansa Musa's journey exemplifies a different narrative, one of prosperity, cultural exchange, and the interconnectedness of the medieval world. His pilgrimage reminds us that even in times of great hardship, other parts of the world were experiencing remarkable periods of growth and influence.
Welcome to the History of Modern Politics. My name is Chris Spangle, and that voice that you heard is Matt Wittlief. And we are on episode 14, or is this 3 of the second season here?
This is episode 3 of season 2 and 14 overall.
Okay, so I like that opening story that you chose because it shows that I think the way that we think about history is very Eurocentric, and that there was the Dark Ages and it was all bad and nothing else was going on in the rest of the world.
Right.
So really interesting story. But in this episode, we're going back to Europe, and we're not going to cover as long of a range of history as we usually do, because we want to keep our main timeline narrative contained to just 40 years, which is a little less than we normally do. And this is the era of the Black Death, and what is sometimes referred to as the crisis of the late Middle Ages. The 14th century was a really, really tough time for Europe. We're going to put the events of the crisis in the context of English history while continuing through the later reign of Edward II and his successor.
Third.
Oh, excuse me, Edward III.
All
Thanks.
good. All good.
Fact time. Jim
Second's
Costa.
long dead.
Yeah. And then his successor, Richard II. So the impact of this crisis, as we'll see today, it's not just one event that creates a crisis here. It leads to a restructuring of society in so many different ways. And this begins to change the political structure of Europe. I mean, you can't have as many people die as you do in this 40-year period without some major changes, as we see how much of Matt, of our society has changed just from COVID, with not nearly a percentage of deaths. So we'll combine these changes along with several other factors, including advances in technology, to see why historians use the late 15th century to delineate the breakpoint between the Middle Ages and the modern period. So we have to do one more episode after this before we get to the end of the Middle Ages. But in episode 16, we'll spend some time wrapping up that artificial breakpoint of that era. So Matt, why don't you kind of get us started here?
Yeah, so we're going to start by looking at the various factors that are typically used by historians to explain the key factors that are contributing to this massive crisis that we experience here in the 13th or 14th century. So we have demographic collapse, we have religious upheaval, and we have political instability. Then we're going to cover the third item as we return to 1359 at the height of Edward III's power, where we left off last time. So the demographic collapse in Europe was widespread, and it goes back to two key events. Everyone knows the Black Death, but before that, we have the Great Famine of 1315 through 1317. Reliable and accurate population estimates are really impossible to construct, but we tried to spend some time doing that with the support of medieval demographers who are trying to put some numbers together. And it's worth trying to center ourselves and understand the general population trends of Europe as we enter this time of the Middle Ages. So, Chris, help put some of this in perspective.
So if we first look at England, traditional estimates put the population of England at about 5 million at its peak around 1300, though some newer, more reliable estimates have this approaching 7 million. There are other estimates which are much lower, but we'll consider 5 to 6 million to be our anchor point. The Domesday Book of 1086, remember that from episode 8, is a source that yields a population of around 2 million and gives us an annual population growth of 0.5%, which is pretty impressive and rivals the population growth globally, not seen until the 19th century.
So for comparison, let's look at what was going on in other areas of Europe at this time. So population estimates for France are actually at about 20 million at this time. So wow. France is really 4 times larger and much more of an... Yeah, they are an economic powerhouse, much more so than England. You know, that population, the lands of the Holy Roman Empire are coming in at around 15 million. But Muslim Spain was probably the largest area of population at this time in Europe, and back at around the year 1000. So it was the largest around the year 1000. But after all the wars of the Reconquista, and we'll cover that in future episodes, slowed the pace of growth down. So by 1300, the Spanish lands were down to about, they were not catching up with the Holy Roman Empire in France. They were only at about 8 million. So the lands in the Italian lands, which, you know, is a variety of different areas that we've covered in the past, come in at about 6 million, although this estimate is really just my own by attempting to account for the various parts of Italy that are not actually counted in the Holy Roman Empire's total. So all over, right, we're looking at about 60 million in the total population of Europe. And it was actually probably closer to 90 million, with the rest spread in the Byzantine Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary, the Scandinavian kingdoms, and the rest of Eastern Europe. So now, interestingly, by contrast, the population of China was probably in itself already around 70 million. And the total population of South Asia, including India, may have already been exceeding 200 million.
So to put that into perspective too, modern Europe is about 750 million people compared to that 60 million that you're talking about back then. Now, these are all estimates that we're talking about. We think it's important to get a sense of scale. So if the European population would have continued at a 0.4% annual growth rate, we would expect to see a total population of about 200 million by 1500. Instead, the population was likely still lower in 1500 than it was in 1300. This 2-year 100 trend of negative population growth also sets the stage for changes in the early modern period too.
Yeah. So the population growth in the High Middle Ages, this time immediately preceding the 14th century crisis, has been dubbed the medieval warm period, and then that's followed by the Little Ice Age. The transition here is not universally agreed upon, and the climate phenomenon was not global in nature, but concentrated in the North Atlantic and Europe. So the relative contribution of climate patterns and the broad trends in population, they can be debated, but the specific climatic events experienced in 1315 definitely and significantly changed the population trajectory.
So it started with a cool and rainy spring that year, which continued on into the summer, and that led to widespread crop failures. Now, I know it's easy for us to think, oh, okay, but literally Halloween, right, is the celebration of the crops that you're bringing in, because that means you're going to live through the winter. So you are raising what you're eating in this day and age. So in economies which are primarily driven by that subsistence agriculture, localized famine is not terribly rare. Local conditions of population, climate, and political factors can lead to some pretty bad food shortages, which at the time means death. And the problem in 1315 was that the weather patterns were prevalent through most of all of Europe, so the effect was no longer localized, which means you couldn't go to the next town or county and maybe import some food. So crop yields collapsed, food would be confiscated for the higher classes, and the peasants suffered first. But crop yields were not enough even to feed the nobility, and imports were not available since everyone was going through the same problems. So starvation made the population more susceptible to disease, and the deaths began to mount. The weather did not improve in 1316, making an already bad situation that much worse. People turned to eating grain seeds, killing productive livestock, which were also feeling the effects of famine, and scavenged for anything that could be edible. There are contemporary reports of the elderly starving themselves so younger people could eat, infanticide, and even cannibalism.
Yeah. So obviously these are catastrophic results. It's almost impossible to reconstruct good estimates here, but it's probably safe to say that 10 to 15% of the population throughout most of the continent died just in this period of 1315 through 1317 as a result of the famine. So this is probably the worst famine of all time in recorded history. Crop yields did not return to normal based on the records that we have until almost 1322, 5 years later. And if we put this in the context of English history that we discussed last time, this is all going on during the crazy turbulent reign of Edward II, which certainly did not help his already poor popularity.
Yeah, it seems like we think of these things separate, Matt, but living through our own lifetime, right? Like, seems like COVID feeds into political instability, which feeds into economic stability. Like, it's all not separate.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think we study history that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, honestly, like, I did not know much about this famine. Everybody knows about the Black Death and how horrible that was in the 1300s. But here we've got this already catastrophic, almost unheard of event that's happening just a couple decades earlier.
If that wasn't enough, we now look at the most deadly plague in human history, the Black Death. And I will preface this by I read Norman Cantor's book on this. So good.
Very good. Very good.
So good. I mean, not good subject, but it's really an interesting book, well written. So there are 4 other epidemics that are worth comparing for perspective. So we need to get a handle on how big this was. Okay. So I'll start with COVID-19. So we bring this up because it's contemporary, right? Conservative estimates, not Republicans, but conservative estimates put the current death toll at about 6.5 million, though there are some estimates out there as far as 20 million. This is about 1 in 1,000 people, or 0.1% of the population. It's bad, but it does not compare with some of the deadliest pandemics in terms of death toll as a percentage of the population.
Yeah. So in recent history, the biggest such epidemic is the HIV and AIDS epidemic. So estimates put the cumulative death toll now at about 36 million, but this is against a larger global population. The duration of the epidemic, quite long. It's been one of the largest death tolls in terms of just gross numbers in human history, but it's mostly under control in Europe and the United States. So, we're not really thinking about HIV AIDS today in the same way as we think about other deadly epidemics.
So I think both of these kind of make us think of the Spanish flu, especially during COVID. We learned a lot about the Spanish flu. Now most of us know about it because of it. And it's 1918 to 1920 and can point to it as a catastrophic epidemic. Matt, there is a Catholic town called Oldenburg in Indiana, and there's all these graves of nuns, and you walk through and every couple months there's a nun that dies. And then from 1919 to 1920, it's like one a week. It's really fascinating. It doesn't even compare to COVID. So the Spanish flu was global in nature and probably killed at least 50 million people, maybe as many as 100 million. This accounts for 3 to 5% of the global population, Matt.
Yeah, pretty terrible. Now we're going to wind way back to the plague of Justinian. We mentioned the Emperor Justinian of the Byzantine Empire in episodes 9 and 12. His name is attached to one of the worst epidemics in history. The plague hit during the years 541 and 542 and likely killed between 30 and 50 million people back then. This is about a quarter of the global population. No, there is some new scholarly research that suggests the plague may have been even worse than this, much small, or excuse me, may not have been that bad. It might have been a lot smaller than the widely accepted narrative, but regardless, the plague of Justinian really is important for another reason, because it's the first appearance of the bacterium Yersinia pestis. So Yersinia pestis is transmitted to humans by fleas that prey upon the black rat, which carries this deadly bacteria. The disease is contracted from the bacteria and is typically referred to as the bubonic plague. You probably know this already, that it's highly contagious and very deadly. We won't go into all the gory details of how the plague works and how it affects people. There's plenty of literature for you to read about that. And it's impossible to know exactly how many people died from the outbreak of the bubonic plague in the 14th century, but estimates range from 75 to 200 million dead during the middle of the century. And this is the recorded onset of the plague starting in 1346, with the peak of the pandemic being over around 1353. So there's ongoing outbreaks that ranged from mild to severe for centuries. This in total is referred to as the second plague pandemic. The ongoing pandemic outbreaks claimed another 10 to 15 million lives, but the surge in 1348 to 1353 is what we refer to as the Black Death. In England, throughout Europe and beyond, societies experienced death rates accounting to as much as a third of the population due to the Black Death, and there are records of entire towns being completely wiped out.
Yeah, I mean, you would feel sick in the morning and be dead by the evening, and the Monty Python, bring out your dead, bring out your dead.
Yeah,
like that's literally what was happening. Is entire towns, eventually there wasn't the person carrying the cart because the whole town died. It's really sad. So now imagine for a moment this timeline of events in England as detailed. By 1311, the leading nobles coordinate with Parliament to pass the Ordinances of 1311, which to a large degree take power from Edward II in favor of a council. Fast forward to 1312, Piers Gaveston is murdered extrajudicially. 1314, the Scots defeat the army of Edward II in the disastrous Battle of Bannockburn. 1315, the famine begins, mass starvation experienced across the country. 1317, the famine continues with nearly 15% of the population dead. 1319, outbreak of disease kills a large amount of livestock, including cattle, oxen, and others which are utilized for plowing fields and agriculture. So your livestock are dead. The people to plow the fields are dead. There's no one to sell to. 1321, the Dispenser War breaks out, creating a new civil war amongst the elites. The effect of the cattle deaths lead to a renewed famine. 1322, the Dispenser Wars end with Thomas of Lancaster, cousin of the king and richest man in England, executed. 1326, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer invade England. 1327, Edward II abdicates. Edward III coronated with real power resting with Isabella and Mortimer. 1330, Edward III takes control, arrests, and executes Mortimer. 1332, war with Scotland is renewed in the Second War of Scottish Independence. 1337, war is declared on France, initiating the 100 Years' War. And 1348, the Black Death arrives in England. So it kind of makes our last decade look kind of like child's play. Think about how rough we've felt through COVID and the Trump years, and that's a lot worse.
This is 37 years of just absolute chaos. And, most people would not have lived through the entire thing, not because 37 years is so long, but just because of the amount of absolute death and destruction that was going on through this. There were people who survived. Can you imagine having lived through this entire experience and then trying to, survive the plague? So famine, war, pestilence, death. It's like the four horsemen of the apocalypse happening here, right? And there's no doubt that medieval Christians thought that God was out to punish them and that the end of the world had to be near.
That's literally what I think, and I just read the list. I've been living through it. So this provides a good opportunity, Matt, for us to pivot to the changes in religious society that were taking place during this era as well, because nothing can stay the same. And as we've covered so far, there is strong interplay between religious society and political society. So why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so we briefly mentioned the era of the Avignon Papacy in our last episode when we noted that King Philip IV engineered the election of Clement V as Pope in 1305. And you'll recall that Philip IV then battled with Pope Boniface VIII over taxation of the church. So that led to the excommunication of Philip. He ignored it and sent his men to arrest Boniface in Italy. The Pope was captured, beaten, escaped, and died shortly after. The next Pope only served several months before dying suddenly, maybe poisoned by some French emissaries in Italy. And Philip took no chances after that and used his influence to have the College of Cardinals settle on his preferred French candidate. So we mentioned in our last episode then that there were anti-popes during this same period. That's partially incorrect. There was only one anti-pope during the Avignon Papacy, but the period which follows this, known as the Western Schism, ran later from 1378 to 1417, which was an era with all sorts of different series of anti-popes. So why do we care about all this? We had the demographic collapse that we described earlier in the 14th century. This is then accompanied by this religious instability. And that begins a radical shift in papal power, moving from the Italian sphere in the Holy Roman Empire to France. So this shift to Avignon came with increased secularization of the cardinals, the papal curia, which is the administrative apparatus of the papacy, and many of the popes themselves. Wealth was ostentatiously on display, and decisions were increasingly viewed as much more political.
Yeah, and I think we can identify, like, okay, you're getting more ostentatious with your wealth while I'm struggling. You're building ballrooms while my SNAP benefits are shut out, right? Like, these are, when you have that wealth disparity starting, I think we can kind of put ourselves back in some of those shoes, those cobbled shoes. Now, astute listeners, you will recall that this is not the first time that popes have acted in ways that are political or have sought riches and glory. It's sort of the story of the papacy. And while this is true, we have also discussed the advances in education and church reforms that were implemented after the worst abuses of the Italian aristocracy. So once we put the Avignon papacy in the backdrop of the 100 Years' War and demographic collapse that we've already discussed in this episode, you can start to see how reactions to a less pious clergy may be a little bit different.
Yeah, and the church had a long history of refining, yet then cementing its theology with thoughts and practices which deviated from the official doctrine of the church. So this is known as heresy. We know that word, and that's what we're talking about here. And it's been met with a variety of tools of the church throughout the centuries. The notion formally of defining the beliefs of the church goes all the way back to the year 325 with the First Ecumenical Council, commonly known as the Council of Nicaea. The refinement of the doctrine of theology and the canon law would continue throughout the centuries, achieving a new fervor in a period of 150 years during the 12th and 13th centuries, where we saw 6 ecumenical councils. So this aligned with the rise of the Crusades, the establishment of universities, and the growth of monasticism. You put all this into context, you can start to see how these heresies would be prosecuted with greater vigor, while also putting pressure on the church elite for everyone to stay in line.
Yeah, you see social fabrics being torn and ripped apart, and you see that in our own time. So here are a few examples of the heresies which emerged in the Middle Ages and how they played into the religious upheaval of the 14th century. So in episode 11, we briefly mentioned the Albigensian Crusade. The say that word for me.
Albigensians.
You did ecumenical. You put in the script the pronouncer for ecumenical, but not the Albigensians. What?
Albigensians.
They were also referred to as the Cathars. This particular group is important less for its beliefs than it is for the fact that the church launched a full military crusade against them.
Yeah. And then you have the Waldensians, another group that deserve mention. They shared many of the views that were asserted by the Franciscan order of monks. We've not mentioned them yet, but this is the famous monastic order founded by St. Francis of Assisi in 1209. And they focused on living a life of poverty, but they were persecuted as heretics because they challenged the authority of local bishops who tried to control the content of their preaching.
And there are 2 other groups similar to the Waldensians. You should read these.
The Waldensians. There you go, man.
Thank you. Who also believed in spiritual poverty that were classified as heretics. The Apostolic Brethren and the Spiritual Franciscans. Those groups are notable in that they were more vocal in attacking the wealth and the excess of the church elite.
Yeah, so many of these groups hold beliefs that would later provide some of the fuel that would be lit in the Protestant Reformation. We're not going to, I mean, we are going to get to that in a future episode. We got to wait a little bit longer to get to that point, but we do want to address a very important early proto-Protestant whose followers, known as the Lollards, end up becoming an important part of the social dynamics in the 14th century here that we're covering in England. And the group of Lollards were the followers of John Wycliffe. We're going to talk about him just a little bit more later in this episode. But first, with the context of the plague and the religious society all explained, we want to get back to our political narrative now. So the third component of the crisis of the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, is political instability. First, we're going to cover popular uprisings in the 14th century that happened outside of England. And then we're going to return to 1359 and our friend King Edward III.
So in our last episode, we mentioned that the county of Flanders retained quasi-independence while acknowledging its fealty to the French crown as a result of the treaty in 1305, which ended the Franco-Flemish War. And the Flemish remained largely pro-English until the death of the count in 1322. The new count, Louis I of Flanders, had been married 2 years earlier to the daughter of King Philip V of France. So Louis shifts allegiances to France and significantly raised taxes on the people of Flanders. This led to one of the first known peasant revolts in Europe. And at one point, the peasant militia controlled several cities, but failed to capture the largest Flemish city, Ghent. Louis appealed to the French, and in 1328, under the leadership of King Philip VI, the peasants were soundly defeated by the French army.
Yeah. And less than a decade later, at the onset of the 100 Years' War, Louis of Flanders again found himself caught between Anglo-French conflict. Still loyal to France, a new uprising would emerge in 1337, but this time it would be the Flemish merchant class rather than the peasant farmers. Now, we've explained the tight alignment of interest between England and Flanders due to the wool trade in the last couple of episodes. And Edward III put pressure on the Count's loyalty to the French crown by threatening to cut Flanders out of the wool trade. This led to the organization of merchants in the major cities of Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres in what became known as the Three Members. Jacob van Artevelde became the leader of the pro-English city leaders who collectively forced Louis to flee Flanders. Flee Flanders. There you go.
Flee Flanders, flee Flanders, flee Flanders.
Van Artevelde essentially ruled Flanders as a pro-business dictator then until his death in 1345. Louis of Flanders would die in the Battle of Crécy, which we mentioned in the last episode.
So these two uprisings in Flanders set an example that traditional royal feudal power could be challenged, not by the landowning aristocracy, as we've already seen in England, but by peasants and merchants. So let's turn now to France in 1356. The peasants of France were facing a triple threat of terror. First, there's the punishing reality of the Black Death. Second, you have the destruction caused by the 100 Years' War. English forces utilized a systemic approach to raiding and pillaging the countryside, much like William the Conqueror's harrying of the North. Villages were burned and farmlands destroyed in these tactics, which became known as the chevauchée, which this was compounded by mercenaries who, when not engaged in organized campaigns, were left to raid and pillage the countryside until their next assignment, because that's how they got paid. Third, the peasants were forced into additional labor and taxes to compensate the ruling class for the losses they were incurring as a result of the war. The French peasant uprising, which lasted from 1356 to 1358, was given the nickname of Jacquerie. The capture of King John II at the Battle of Poitiers, there we go, like Sidney Poitier,
there you go,
really set the wheels in motion.
Yeah, the Jacquerie peasant revolt was not the only political turmoil going on in France of note. So while the king's now in exile, if you recall, he's captured in England, the regency falls to his son, Charles, the Dauphin. He was 18 and considered old to be old enough to be the king, but he faced opposition in both the upper ranks of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. So recall that one of the major sources of conflict in the 100 Years' War was the succession to the French crown after the end of the Capetian line. John II and, of course, the Dauphin were descendants through the new Valois line. Edward III if you recall, then pressed his case on being the oldest grandson of Philip IV. There's a third claimant, the House of Evreux. That claimant, also named Philip, because, we got to keep names confusing, married Joan of Navarre, who was the daughter of King Louis X, also in the royal line. We've only briefly mentioned Navarre previously in other episodes. It's a kingdom that straddled the modern-day borders of France and Spain. The Kingdom of Navarre was unified with the French crown through marriage in 1284, and succession law in Navarre allowed inheritance through the female line. So the House of Evreux retained the Kingdom of Navarre, while the House of Valois took the French crown. So you have splits due to different laws of inheritance in France and Navarre.
So that little sidebar is important because it sets up the other front of opposition to Charles the Dauphin. The King of Navarre, I'm sorry, his name is also Charles. Maybe he's married to a Marie. Let's see. Used the absence of John to press his claim to the French crown and cause trouble for the Dauphin. And the House of Evreux happened to also hold lands in Normandy and had originally come from the region east of Paris in Champagne. So the opposition to the Dauphin came from the south, east, and the north.
Yeah, and the last bit to add here is that King Charles of Navarre was the bourgeoisie of Paris. The Estates General of France met first in 1302 under Philip IV. Now, this body was far less organized or powerful than what we have witnessed in the English Parliament. It's made up of the three estates: the clergy, the first estate; the nobility, the second estate; and the commoners, the third estate. However, the Estates General seized the moment in the power vacuum during the exile of King John to assert more authority over the Dauphin. A Paris merchant named Etienne Marcel became the leader of the third estate and sought to impose limits on the monarchy through what became known as the Great Ordinance of 1357, which would reform administrative functions and empower a committee to place a check on the king. Now, I think, side note, right, this is like one of the first times we see the French people trying to put checks on the king, like we have already been seeing for a couple centuries in England. So anyways, Marcel joins up with Charles of Navarre, and the Dauphin was run out of Paris. The Jacquerie were ready to side against the monarchy, but when members of the nobility were murdered, it was viewed that Marcel had gone just a little bit too far. So loyalists turned on him, and then he in turn was executed. Charles was run out of Paris, and the Jacquerie were decimated then by royal forces. Marcel was executed. The Dauphin returned to Paris, but still had just a tenuous grip on power.
So let's hop back to England. We now return to where we left off in the last episode with Edward III at the height of his power and glory. He held territory across France, and the King John of France was his prisoner. The Treaty of London was rejected by the Estates General, and Edward III decided to make an attempt to capture Paris. They planned the attack for Easter Monday of 1360. The French refused to meet them in battle that night. A massive storm killed as many of 1,000 souls of the English and several thousand horses. Man, what a storm. And Edward was convinced that this was a sign to halt the attack and return to the negotiating table. In May, the Treaty of Brittany was signed, and England still retained a lot, but John's ransom was reduced, and some lands that were going to go to England in the Treaty of London remained with France. Importantly, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne, and this created a temporary peace in the 100 Years' War.
By the mid-1370s, war had resumed again. However, King Edward III and the Prince of Wales, Edward the Black Prince, one of the best names of all time, right?
Yeah.
Were both ill. And many of Edward III's most senior officers and advisors were already dead as well. Remember, plague. A new generation was taking control of the government and military. In France, King John II had died in 1364, and the throne did pass on to the Dauphin, who became now King Charles V. He revived the French war efforts and erased most of the gains that England had made during the 1350s. Discontent grows in England, and with all the burdens of war and plague. And before we close out the reign of Edward III, let's take a quick look at the key legislation that was passed during his reign. His heirs, and the key parliamentary activities that are going on. After all, this is
so let's
political
start,
history, right?
Right, yeah. So in 1349, in response to the shortage of labor and demand for increased wages as a result of the Black Death, Parliament passed the Ordinance of Laborers. This mandated that everyone under 60 years old must work and implemented wage and price controls in an effort to keep both at pre-plague levels. So they wanted essentially to keep the wages and the prices stuck in a period of time, even though it all should have fallen. This failed and led to the updated Statute of Laborers in 1351, which tried to reinforce the prior ordinance with greater detail. That works. This law greatly supported the landowners and employers and was resented by the peasants, even though enforcement proved difficult.
Imagine all that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have a total decimation of workforce. I mean, labor is a part of it, is supply and demand when it comes to labor, a piece of it.
Absolutely. And so another important law passed in this time was the Pleading in English Act of 1362. And this mandated that court proceedings would take place in the English language instead of Norman French. So this is a big change. This is a big cultural shift toward making England English. And while not a parliamentary law, it's worth noting that King Edward III, who also implemented the chivalric order of the famous order of the Garter, an exclusive club that became a new centerpiece in the English peerage and honor system. Again, this is another move towards making England a clear and independent entity away from its prior connection to France.
Plus, I think it's also a win for the regular person who spoke English, so now they can understand their court proceedings.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It makes it more attainable. So as personal wealth grew among the lower classes due to changing economic conditions, Parliament passed the Act of Apparel of 1363. More money meant that the middle class was starting to dress more like the elite. This law, known as a sumptuary law, restricted the colors and types of clothing that could be worn by people based on their class. While this clearly had an intent to keep people in their place, it was also intended to help regulate the trade of wool and other textiles that were central to the English economy.
Yeah, so now we're going to do one of our fun genealogy tours here and do a quick review of Edward III's children, because this is going to become very important for future events that are coming up. So we're going to talk about them relative to the year 1375, where the aging king is 63 years old. So by this time, 5 of his 7 sons were alive, and just 4 of his 5 daughters were alive. All of the deceased daughters died without having any children. So we start with Edward, the Black Prince. He's 45 years old at this time and married to Joan of Kent, the daughter of Edmund of Woodstock, who we referred to last episode as the Earl of Kent, who's the brother of Edward II, right? So of the royal line, who helped depose him with Isabella and Mortimer. So this is a bit of an odd marriage, as Joan was a few years older than Edward and had already been married twice before. They had 2 sons while living in Aquitaine, Edward of Angoulême, who died in 1370 at just the young age of 5, and Richard of Bordeaux, who was just 8 years old at the time in 1375.
So Isabella was 43, married to a French nobleman with whom she fell in love, which is rare in those days, while she was part of a prisoner exchange related to King John II's captivity. They had 2 daughters and just 1 granddaughter, after which there were no further children.
So now we have Lionel. He was born in Antwerp in Flanders during the early stages of the 100 Years' War, and he was given the title Duke of Clarence in 1362. So let's do a quick sidebar here. It's during Edward III's reign that the title of Duke starts to really enter into the English peerage system. The Black Prince was given the title Duke of Cornwall in 1337, and this title has subsequently been given, along with Prince of Wales, to the heir apparent of the throne. The second dukedom was given to Henry of Grosmont in 1351. He was dubbed the Duke of Lancaster. Henry was one of Edward III's most trusted advisors and celebrated military commanders. He's also the son of the younger brother of the Earl of Lancaster, who challenged Edward II in the last episode. So with his land holdings, he was one of the wealthiest Englishmen outside of Edward III himself. So let's go ahead.
So let's hop back to Lionel. He married Elizabeth de Burgh, heiress to both the de Burgh and the de Clare land holdings, 2 wealthy Anglo-Norman families that we've covered in episode 11, with royal bloodlines through both her mother and her father. So the title of Duke of Clarence was related to the de Clare land holdings. Lionel died in 1368, and his oldest daughter, Philippa, was 20 years old in 1375 and married to Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March and great-grandson of the famous Roger Mortimer, who usurped Edward II.
Yeah. And Edward's third oldest surviving son was John of Gaunt, known as the Red Prince. Now, John was born in Ghent in Flanders and was 35 years old. The name of Gaunt is an old English pronunciation of Ghent. John first married Blanche of Lancaster, the daughter of Henry of Grosmont that we just talked about. Henry died in 1361 and Blanche died in 1368, leaving all of the wealthy lands of Lancaster into the control of John. He was made Duke of Lancaster at the same time his brother was made Duke of Clarence. They had 2 daughters and a son, not the 2 brothers, but John of Gaunt and his first wife. And the son was Henry. John then married Constance of Castile. She was the daughter of King Peter of Castile, that's down in the Spanish lands, who had been deposed by his brother. So John then claimed the throne of Castile for himself and his wife as the rightful heir, but he was never successful in being recognized in Castile as king. They had one daughter named Catherine.
Edmund of Langley was 34 years old, and he was married to Isabella of Castile, the younger sister of Constance. They had 2 young children by 1375 and had a third a bit later, and we will revisit that in the next episode. And then there's finally Thomas of Woodstock. He was 20 years old and not yet married.
So in the spring of 1376, Parliament is convened after nearly 3 years, which was one of the longest gaps between sessions in the 14th century. John of Gaunt assumed leadership on behalf of his father, as the Black Prince had died during the session. This became known as the Good Parliament and featured an angry House of Commons intent on putting on more checks on Edward III's government and Gaunt in particular, whom they viewed as power hungry. A year later, the session known as the Bad Parliament followed, with Gaunt reversing many of the restrictions on the crown which were passed previously. 1377 would see the death of King Edward III and the succession of Richard of Bordeaux, who became King Richard II at only 10 years old. So Parliament put in a Regency Council, which excluded Gaunt and Richard's other uncles, Edmund and Thomas, from being part of the council.
But the burdens of the war and all the other factors we've discussed all came to a head finally. A new poll tax was passed in the Parliament of 1380, which proved to be too large of a burden for the commoners to accept. And this led to what is known as the Peasants' Revolt, also named the Great Rising or Wat Tyler's Rebellion. And it started in Essex in southeast England when violence erupted upon a refusal to pay taxes. The energy and violence spread like wildfire, with Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and John Ball emerging as the leaders. Little is known about Tyler or Straw, but John Ball was a radical preacher and follower of John Wittlief. Ball had been jailed, but was released along with many others by the rebels. Ball is credited with the following sermon intended to rile up support for the rebellion.
When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? From the beginning, all men by nature were created alike, and our bondage or servitude came in by the unjust oppression of naughty men. For if God would have had any bondman from the beginning, he would have appointed who should be bond and who free. And therefore I exhort you to consider that now is the time is come, appointed to us by God, in which ye may, if ye will, cast off the yoke of bondage and recover liberty.
The rebels moved toward London, seeking to punish the aristocracy. Richard II was not their target, but his advisors, the upper ranks of the clergy, and his uncles, and Gaunt in particular, were their primary targets. On June 13th, sympathetic Londoners allowed the peasants' army to enter. The rebels opened the jails and burned down the Savoy Palace, which was the home of John of Gaunt, burned legal documents, and generally wreaked havoc. On the 14th, Richard II agreed to meet the rebels and issued charters to give self-rule to many towns and abolish serfdom. He stopped short of handing over royal officials to the rebels for execution. Phew. But meanwhile, a force of rebels entered the Tower of London and murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord High Treasurer, and many others. And Gaunt and other leading men, along with most of the royal army, were away from London on various missions. So the following day, Richard met again with the rebels, this time with a small force of about 200 that he was able to gather. He met with Wat Tyler, who remained unsatisfied. A dispute emerged, and Richard's men killed Tyler on the spot. The 14-year-old king was able to convince the rebels to stand down and defuse the situation. The king was able to muster a force of 4,000 soldiers, and the following day, to further suppress the revolt, which had continued to spread in pockets throughout England. In the end, over 1,500 rebels were killed in skirmishes or executed from mid-June through the summer.
So the reforms promised by Richard II didn't hold. So serfdom in general, in its general definition of peasants being bonded to the land of the manor, was already in decline, and it continued to decline more rapidly in the late 14th century. Serfs were gaining some freedoms and living under lease agreements rather than feudal obligations. There's no one distinct moment in English law where there's a clean transition, but this is the era where we see changes in the arrangements and the structure of property law, which will later then become a foundation for economic expansion.
During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, Richard was waiting for his bride to arrive in England. He married Anne of Bohemia, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. In 1382, they were both 15 years old. Until her death in 1394, due to a new outbreak of the plague, which would continue to return many times, though on a much smaller scale, Anne was viewed as a moderating influence on Richard. This era was punctuated by tensions of the 100 Years' War and the jockeying for political power between supporters of John of Gaunt and Richard's circle of advisors led by Michael de la Pole, the Lord Chancellor who came from a merchant family and was made Earl of Suffolk.
Yeah, in late 1386 brought what became known as the Wonderful Parliament. Richard II wanted to ask for more money, as kings do, and instead received the rebuke of the Commons. They demanded the removal of de la Pole and wanted to have the authority to approve all of Richard's inner circle of advisors. In addition to de la Pole, there was particular concern of Richard's advisor, Robert de Vere, who had been elevated to the Marquess of Dublin, the first to ever hold the title of Marquess in England. This happened in 1385, and he was then elevated to the Duke of Ireland in October of 1386 before Parliament convened. So as we mentioned earlier, the title of Duke was new during the later reign of Edward III. The remaining uncles of Richard II got the titles of Duke of York, that's Edmund of Langley, and Duke of Gloucester, which was Thomas of Woodstock. In 1385, this happened in 1385, but this elevation of de Vere and the influence of de la Pole was beginning to remind folks of Edward II playing favorites with Piers Gaveston and the Despensers. Richard's still just 19 years old at this time, and he's infuriated by the demands, but he ultimately relents the threat of despotism. Of deposition, being deposed. In turn, Parliament set up a commission, later to be known as the Lords Appellant, to place a check on Richard's inner circle. Richard gathered a judicial council to render Parliament's actions illegal, conducted secret negotiations with France that would seek their aid against his enemies, and raised an army under de Vere to go arrest the Lords Appellant. The Lords Appellant, under the leadership of Richard's uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, met de Vere's forces in battle and won decisively. Richard was left as a figurehead, and Parliament was called early in 1388.
So in what would be known as the Merciless Parliament, which I think we need to start doing this.
I love all these names, right? The 121st Congress. No, come on.
The Merciless Parliament. Just hearing about it, I'm like, let's learn what this is about. Richard's inner circle was condemned. Some had already gone into voluntary exile to avoid trial, while others were executed or imprisoned. It was ugly, and all control was now with the Lords Appellant. John of Gaunt returned from his unsuccessful attempt to claim his throne in Castile and proved to be a moderating force on the political turmoil. So Richard regained control over the affairs of his government and again sought a truce with France. With Anne now dead, Isabella, daughter of King Charles VI of France, was offered as a bride in the peace treaty. Richard II, now 29, was betrothed to the 6-year-old girl in 1396. Richard then returned to vengeance. After relative peace for nearly 10 years, he moved against his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Earl of Arundel, two of the former Lords Appellant. Gloucester died while in prison, likely on the orders of the king, and Arundel was executed. Later in the same month, Richard gave out 5 new dukedoms, likely to curry favor and loyalty from his former opponents and reward tacit or explicit support in the move against Gloucester.
Yeah, so the new dukes are Henry Bolingbroke, the former Lord Appellant and the oldest living son of John of Gaunt. He's made Duke of Hereford. Edward Norwich, son of Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, was made the Duke of Aumale, and which is named after a region in Normandy. John Holland, he's half-brother of Richard II through Joan of Kent's first marriage to Thomas Holland, who was the Earl of Kent. You'll recall that later she married the Black Prince. So John Holland was made Duke of Exeter. John Holland's older brother, named Thomas, after his father, died earlier in 1397. So his oldest son was, of course, also named Thomas. So this Thomas, who's half-nephew now, if you're following along, to King Richard, but actually only just 5 years younger than him, was elevated to the Duke of Surrey. And finally, we have the new titles for the Duke and Duchess of Norfolk. To make things tricky, the Duke and Duchess were not married. Margaret of Norfolk was the daughter of Thomas, the Earl of Norfolk, a half-brother of King Edward II, who was referred to simply as Norfolk in the last episode as one of the key supporters of Isabella and Mortimer, key supporters of in their deposition of King Edward II. So they were on the side of Isabella. He was on the side of Isabella Mortimer. She inherited the earldom of Norfolk and the title of Earl Marshal, the only woman in English history to hold the title, on the death of her father in 1338. So by 1397, she was in her mid-70s and the eldest surviving member of the House of Plantagenet at this time. Margaret went on to marry John Seagrave, a baron whose family were prominent military commanders. Their estates were passed to their daughter, who married John de Mowbray, another baronial military man who was the great grandson of Henry III, King Henry III, through his mother. Their son, former Lord Appellant Thomas de Mowbray, was elevated to Duke of Norfolk alongside his grandmother. So I know that's a ton of names, but we've got Duke creep here, right? So like Richard's just throwing out titles to try to make people happy. And if you read these history books and listen to other history of this time, I mean, these names, Norfolk and de Mowbray and Holland and all these are, they are important players in the stage that is before us here.
But one thing we've learned is that the more people you give titles and lands to, the more of a headache they become. And the more headaches you have, the more likely you're to lose your head. Bolingbroke. Yeah. At the end, Bolingbroke. At the end of the year, Hereford, Henry Bolingbroke, and Norfolk, Thomas de Mowbray, became embroiled in a dispute, which was ruled by Richard II to be resolved by a duel. That's one way to thin out the herd. Richard stepped in at the last moment and ruled to exile them both instead of having one die. Richard became increasingly tyrannical and had all of the outcomes of the Merciless Parliament overturned. John of Gaunt, who had to some degree moderated the player on all sides, had died in 1399. And shortly thereafter, Bolingbroke returned from exile with a small band of supporters. He quickly gained support and moved to overthrow Richard II. The king quickly capitulated and agreed to abdicate. And he was held prisoner in the Tower of London, and Parliament convened to formally depose Richard and offer the crown to Bolingbroke, who would henceforth be known as King Henry IV.
That's right. So we're going to wrap things up here. Late 1399, we've got a new king, or on the verge of a new century. We've seen a king abdicate. We've seen lots of death. You may expect that this story doesn't end here, and you're right. There's going to be another 85 years of turmoil and war, both home and abroad, before we finally transition from the late Middle Ages to the early modern period with the coronation of someone named Henry Tudor.
Yeah, you're basically not going to have any peace or stability or anything till like roughly 1992. So, and that lasts roughly until 2001. So we had a good 8 years as a species of peace. So it's all over, folks.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us here on the History of Modern Politics. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And we hope you weren't confused by all the dang Charles and Margarets and Henrys. So thanks so much for joining us. Please share this if you got something out of it. And you can go subscribe to our Substack and find all kinds of goodies there. So stay tuned.
We're going to start putting out more content there. So that's exciting.
We'll see you soon in episode 15.
All right. Thanks, Chris.